Good evening and welcome. My name is John Coatsworth. I'm the acting dean of the School of International and Public Affairs here at Columbia, and it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. I can't recall exactly when I first met Richard Bulliet, but I know I'd heard of him for many years because at one point I was involved in a project with a series of other authors, including one from Columbia, to produce a world history. And the model that we thought we should look at first is known as in the trade as the Bulliet text. It was given to us as the sort of model of what we would have to compete against, and we gave up, actually. It was just too good. So I met Richard Bulliet through his work long before I met him in person. My most memorable recollection of Richard Bulliet occurred when we were negotiating a series of meetings that took place in my office downstairs with, indirectly or directly, with representatives of the Islamic Republic of Iran, whose president had expressed an interest in coming to visit Columbia. And as you know, as a result of the good offices of Professor Bulliet, he did come and made an inspiring speech following a remarkable introduction by our president. But part of the inspiration for this evening's speech, and indeed for the lecture series that followed and the conference that took place last week, was the desire on the part of Professor Bulliet, President Bollinger, myself, and others to make the Ahmadinejad visit part of a longer series of events that would examine the 3 decades of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I should say a word or two about Professor Bulliet. He hails from Rockford, Illinois. He received his academic degrees from Harvard University, where he stayed on to teach for 6 years, and then, like many of us, moved on to bigger and better things. After 2 years at the University of California at Berkeley, he joined the Columbia faculty in 1976. At Columbia, he has taught all periods of Middle Eastern history, as well as the history of technology, the history of domestic animals, and all 4 of the Columbia College core curriculum courses. He served for 12 years as the director of the Middle East Institute. He's published too many books on the Middle East and Middle Eastern history for me to be able to read the titles of them all. But he has written 3 works on Islamic social history with an emphasis on Iran that all of you must know. And if you don't, I will read their titles. The Patricians of Nishapur, his first book, I believe, published in 1972. Conversion to Islam in the Medieval Period in 1979, a work of quantitative history at a point where quantitative history just wasn't done on medieval history. And Islam, The View from the Edge, published in 1993. His book on the history of technology, The Camel and the Wheel, published in 1975, won the Dexter Prize of the Society for the History of Technology. His most recent books are The Case for Islamo-Christian Civilization, published in 2004, and Hunters, Herders, and Hamburgers, The Past and Future of Human-Animal Relationships, published in 2005. The title of his talk this evening is the title of the series of talks and the conference which many of you have attended over the course of this semester. 3 decades, the 3 decades of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I can't think of anybody better qualified to enlighten us on a subject that continues to inspire great controversy and many errors of foreign policy. Professor Bulliet.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate those remarks. And I appreciate all of the help you gave last fall when we were setting up that infamous confrontation between the 2 presidents. If we had 3, then we could have sort of the 3 presidents show or something. This is a particularly important talk for me, which means I've been nervous about it for the last 2 weeks, not longer. Because it, in a sense, is the 4th decade of my engagement with the Islamic Republic of Iran. in exactly the same time frame. That is to say, in 1978, the revolution was gathering pace. By the end of the summer in August, it was pretty clear that a revolution was coming. And during that summer, trying to steal a march on history, I wrote a novel based on the idea that a revolution led by someone like Khomeini could overthrow the Shah of Iran. Regrettably, my publisher did not see fit to publish the novel for a year and a half, and by that time, the U.S. hostage has been taken, and my remarkably prescient novel had become old hat and didn't sell any copies. Nevertheless, I was very deeply interested in what was going on with Iran in '78. Then you skip a decade, and you get to 1988. You'll see the sign here on the podium, the International Conference on Aggression and Defense. This was at the end of the Iran-Iraq War. This is in the summer of '88, just 2 or 3 weeks after Ayatollah Khomeini had announced that he was sort of drinking his cup of poison and agreeing to end the war. And this was the first time that, to the best of my knowledge, any Americans were formally invited. I'm not talking about carrying a ceremonial cake or something to swap for arms, but any Americans were formally invited back to Iran. And that was my first glimpse of what the country was like 10 years into the revolution. A person in this room who I shall not otherwise identify climbed a little ways up a lamppost to cut down this sign for me as they lined the boulevards of Tehran to welcome the conferees. And it was a thoroughly memorable experience, perhaps one of the most memorable moments being after we had driven in from the airport and passed miles of revolutionary and war paintings along the boulevards of, the evil Americans and the evil Iraqis and the evil Brits and so forth. We get to the hotel, the Great Freedom Hotel, as it had been renamed. I think it was the Intercontinental before. And I go up to the desk and identify myself. It was a reservation from Richard Bulliet. And the clerk says, "Oh, how wonderful to have the Americans back. Khosh Amadid, we are so happy to see you. We really are so happy the Americans are back." And I suddenly, after being on pins and needles for hours and in flight, I felt so at home to have this warm welcome. So I registered and I turned around, and there on the mezzanine was this long sign that said, "Death to America." And one of the things, that was the first time I learned it, is that there is almost a complete disjuncture between what you hear from the Iranian government and what you experience on the ground with Iranians in Iran. And that's an important factor because so few Americans go to Iran that we tend to be not simply overly taken with what the government says, but even more overly taken by what the American government says about what the Iranian government says. I mean, we have this sense of a very controlled media environment with respect to Iran. So then we run forward another 10 years to 1998. About this time of the year, I got a telephone call from the president of the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., asking me to be their keynote speaker for their fall conference, which is sort of the big academic Middle East conference in Washington held in the fall of every year. And I sort of asked him if he had the right number because I was a medievalist and that usually is for people who are retired diplomats and so forth. I said, no, they like something different. So I gave a talk called 20 Years of Islamic Politics, which was subsequently published in the spring of '99 in Middle East Journal. And I brought up a number of themes, themes that related to comparative revolutions. They related to issues regarding the power of and structure of military political forces, themes that related to Islam as a political force in the Muslim world, and themes that related very generally to the nature of constitutional government, the nature of the state in the Middle East. So now we come up to 2008. It's 30 years since the revolution gained headway. And I feel very much that I have to say something that will somehow be within the sort of series of talks that, or thinking that I have done and that nobody else really cares about. But nevertheless, this is an important talk for me. The comparative the comparative revolutionary aspect is where I'm going to start. 10 years ago, I observed that 20 years into the Iranian Revolution, if you compared the Iranian Revolution with a number of other revolutions, you would have to conclude that the Iranians weren't doing so bad. In the first place, they survived for 20 years. The French only made it through 10. And a lot of revolutions don't survive. They get swallowed up in something else, or else there is a counter-revolution and they get overturned. If you were to make an inventory of revolutions, the number of revolutions that have a 20-year success rate would be fairly small. But now we're dealing with 30 years. Well, what I talked about 10 years ago was something that I refer to as the 30-year disease. Revolutions become upset after 30 years. And this is not coincidental. 30 years is a threshold period for a revolution. Now, the reason for this, I'll explain as sort of a combination by combining two thinkers, Max Weber and Ibn Khaldun. Max Weber talks about revolutionary moments under the concept of charisma, that is, by which he means a moment when a person or a movement or a situation allows for essentially a restatement of what the fundamental laws and what the fundamental political order might be, or the fundamental religious order. In other words, it's a moment of intervention into the normal world of affairs that changes things. It can be a charismatic individual, but that wasn't essential to the idea. He has a second thought, corollary to the first, which is that charisma doesn't last. And that moment, however it comes about, of the overturning of the existing order has to be followed by some sort of routinization. It has to be followed by something that will standardize it, organize it, and make it work. This is very sensible, and you can find many examples to show this. But part of the problem in understanding it is that there was no time frame in which this would happen, and that is where Ibn Khaldun, a 14th century North African writer, adds a different variation to this idea. For Ibn Khaldun, what Weber calls charisma, he calls asabiya. This is an Arabic term that has been awkward to translate by the various people who have attempted translating it, often translated as group feeling, and is attributed in particular to the types of bonds that exist within a kinship group living in a rural or desert environment. The ideal notion is that of the tribe. And yet the asabi of the tribe is ultimately not what he talks about when he sees this as the root source of the rise of a new regime, because he really talks about how sometimes there's an extraordinary asabiya, an extraordinary sense of dynamic, new, binding thought or inspiration that overcomes the particular senses of group feeling of individual tribes and binds them together into a broad movement. And when that happens, you get a synergism that allows this grander asabiya to overthrow an existing regime and establish a new one. Clearly, asabiya and charisma are not exactly the same thing, but they're close enough for my purposes here. What Ibn Khaldun adds, and what it tends to be ignored by people who study Ibn Khaldun, is that when he talks about routinization, instead of classifying the ways in which this moment of historical inspired change comes about, instead of classifying the way in which it comes about or making it just sort of a general concept, he puts a timetable on it. He says that an asabiya sufficient to create a new regime and overthrow the previous regime lasts for 3 generations, and in the 4th generation it becomes so attenuated and so weak that the dynasty that has been that's been established through it becomes marcescent. That is to say, it becomes like a withered leaf on a tree in the fall. It hasn't fallen off yet, but the slightest breeze will take it away. So the dynasty doesn't necessarily end after 4 generations, but rather in the 4th generation it becomes vulnerable to a new movement. He also specifies the length of a generation, and this is the part that I think has been unduly ignored. He says a generation is 40 years long, and he bases this on the story of the Israelites and under the leadership of Moses when they leave Egypt. And he says they sojourned in the wilderness for 40 years, so that no one who had been born in slavery in Egypt would still be there when the Israelites moved into the lands that God had vouchsafed to them. So that the purpose of 40 years was to mark the change of a generation. That, I think, was a very perceptive idea, because when you have people who have lived through a revolution, they rarely believe that the people who come after them share or can possibly even imagine what it was that they themselves did. So that what we're dealing here in Iran with 30 years, and I'm not saying 40 because there are ways in which you can show that the lead up to the Iranian Revolution of 78 begins in the late 60s. In other words, you already have a decade before the revolution that is preparing for it, and then you have the 30 years of the revolution. What's happening is that the first generation is passing away. Now, that doesn't mean they're all dying, but it means they are retiring. And even more, they're beginning to think back as to what can we do to sustain the glorious revolution for the next generation that, unlike ours, has not known the heroism of the revolution itself. Let me just read what Ibn Khaldun says about the second generation. It's partially applicable and partially not. For Ibn Khaldun, this means in the first generation you've overthrown the existing order and set up your new state. It says, under the influence of royal authority and a life of ease, the second generation changes from the desert attitude to sedentary culture, from privation to luxury and plenty, from a state in which everybody shared in the glory to one in which one man claims all the glory for himself, while the others are too lazy to strive for glory, and from proud superiority to humble subservience. Thus the vigor of group feeling, asabiya, is broken to some extent. People become used to lowliness and obedience, but many of the old virtues remain in them because they had had direct personal contact with the first generation and its conditions, and had observed with their own eyes its prowess and striving for glory and its intention to protect and defend itself. They cannot give all of it up at once, although a good deal of it may go. They live in hope that the conditions that existed in the first generation may come back, or they live under the illusion that those conditions still exist. I think that actually is a pretty good description of what happens in the generational shift that you get in revolutions. That once you get to 30 years into the revolution, if you're still surviving in a revolutionary format, the people who are leaving the scene become concerned about what is going to come after them. And the people who come after them are not being inspired by the same vision or goals as the original participants in the revolution, or they are not being inspired to the same degree because there are new visions and goals that have set in with the process of routinization, with the institutionalization of what the revolution brought about. Now, Iran, the Iranian Revolution, they've made it now through 30 years. There's no Napoleon. There's no Stalin. They hold elections regularly. It is commonplace in this country to simply dismiss the elections in Iran. But every time there's an election in Iran that doesn't come out the way the U.S. government predicts it will, then we're astonished because it looks like, hey, that election actually meant something. So when a liberal was elected with President Khatami, so how did that happen? And then when a conservative was elected with Ahmadinejad, how did that happen? Well, maybe it's because they actually have elections that mean something. Just a hypothesis. I don't want to press it too far because, as we all know, and I will come back to this, you do not have a completely free and even playing field for anyone who wants to run for office in Iran. Some people really have no possibility of being approved to run for office. Fortunately, in this country, the way in which we choose candidates for high office is so regularized and so sensible and so open to every possible shade of opinion that as long as you have, let's say, $100 million and can finance your own campaign, you have a pretty good chance of being nominated. Now, I think you could say that in both cases you have imperfections in the democratic system. But in the democratic system, everywhere in the world, once you get beyond the level of the town meeting, you have elections, you have offices, you so have various institutions, but the issue of who gets to run is never constitutional. It's always problematic, and different places handle it in different ways. So I'm not going to say the Islamic Republic of Iran is a democratic state. All I'll say is that for 30 years they've managed to hold elections on a regular basis, and the elections have brought some people to power and dismissed others from power, and those people who were dismissed from power did not want to go. Like elected officials elsewhere, they would prefer to sup at the public trough for the rest of their lives, and they're voted out of office, and no one has ever refused to leave office, contrary to the old slogan of one man, one vote, one time that was floated around at the time of the Algerian coup of 1992, as if when a Muslim activist is elected to office, he will destroy the state in order to remain in power. Well, collectively, perhaps that is what happens in Iran, but individually, there are people who have been voted out of office and are pretty pissed off by it. So it's an electoral system. As I say, not many revolutions make it to 30 with something like this, without having fallen prey to the to the Scylla of military rule or the Charybdis of one-party dictatorship. Iran is still in there, but this is a moment of great fragility for Iran, and it's a moment of great concern, I think, for Iranians and for people who pay attention to Iran, whether they are friendly toward Iran or whether they are dismayed by Iran. But this is a moment of great fragility for Iran. Now, this gets me to my second topic, which is the military. The Iranian Revolution belongs to a subset of revolutions in which you start with the overthrow of the preceding government, and then you follow it with a war to defend the revolution. There are places where you start by overthrowing the government. Take the Egyptian Revolution of 1952. Hey, you overthrew it, you're done. No subsequent war. Of course, you could always attack Israel, but nevertheless. Or actually, Israel could attack you. But that still took 4 years before the attack on Egypt came. So you have some revolutions where you pull off the revolution and then it's done. But in some cases, after the revolution, there are people who try to destroy the revolution. The best example that we can think of in a room like this is the American Revolution. We announced the Declaration of Independence, and the King of England, unwisely, rejected that and sent an army. So we had to fight a war. Now, the American Revolution and the way it handled that war is almost unique. And the reason it's unique is because the Declaration of Independence was not made by a state or a colony. It was made by 13 separate entities, each of which had a militia. And while there was a Continental Army that was formed to fight the war, the Continental Army consisted of a regular soldiery and the militias of the several colonies that became the first states. What happened at the end of the war is that the Continental Army was disbanded. You did not have a federal army at the end of the Revolutionary War. The war was won. What you retained was a force of soldiers at West Point. You retained one battery of artillery, and you retained, I think, 4 regiments of soldiers who were supposed to be guarding the frontiers. But the states retained their militias, and it was understood, first in the Articles of Confederation and then in the Constitution, including the notorious Second Amendment of the Constitution, that maintaining a militia was a very important part of the state. So the possibility of a military takeover of the new United States was nil, because it would be a takeover by the Virginians or by the folks from Massachusetts or by New Jersey, more likely. I mean, who was going to take over once you had disbanded the Federal Army? When you get up to the beginning of the 1800s, to the Jefferson administration, for the first time, you have an effort by a president to recreate a military force for the United States. And this comes in the context of the United States, or particularly Jefferson and the Virginians, feeling that they had to resist the Barbary pirates, as they were called, in the slave raiding and taxation that they put on merchant vessels. The merchant vessels that they were putting this imposition on in 1805 were almost all from Massachusetts. Massachusetts was dead set against fighting the Barbary pirates. Virginia, which didn't have any merchant vessels involved, said, let's build a navy and fight the Barbary pirates. And this was the big fight between Virginia and Massachusetts. And what happened was that Massachusetts, Connecticut, and some of the other New England states said, if we let the federal government have a navy, then next they're going to want to have an army. And then next the states are going to lose their independence. And of course, there was a navy set up for the Barbary pirates, but then the U.S. was overtaken by events in the War of 1812 when a federal army became a necessity. But by that time, the basic constitutional forms had been established and had gone through, had gone through 20 years of maturing, and the army was integrated into the government in a way that allowed civilian rule to continue in a constitutional form. Now, by contrast, you have the French Revolution. French Revolution, you have a revolution, you overthrow the government, and then everyone in Europe tries to invade you. And you conscript masses of Frenchmen who have never been in the army before to fight for the new French Republic. And in the process of that fighting, the state becomes militarized to such a degree that the most able of the military commanders, Napoleon Bonaparte, becomes the emperor and the republic disappears. So here's a case where the war leads to a takeover by the army and the end of the constitutional regime of the republic. A third example would be the Russian Revolution of 1918, where you had a revolution, a takeover of government, and then you had a series of wars against white Russian armies in which the Red Army, which was inspired and put together by Leon Trotsky, succeeded in defending the new Soviet regime. And the party led by Stalin, I'm oversimplifying, I know, to some degree, but he said, no, we can't let the army take over. Trotsky and his friends were purged. And in the 1930s, most of the senior officers in the Red Army were eliminated, so that by the time of World War II, the Red Army had lost much of its senior officer corps through the purges. And the party took over and the army became subordinate to the party. Now the question we have with Iran then is here we have three patterns. A revolution in which you defend the revolution and then you disband your centralized army because of the possibility of having local militias. Or you have a revolution in which the army that is built up to defend the revolution takes over the revolution. Or you have an army in Russia where you have a revolution and the army that is formed to defend the revolution essentially has a shootout with the party that then becomes the dominant force in the regime, irrespective of the theoretically high-sounding words of the Soviet Constitution. So what happens in Iran? What is interesting in Iran, in this comparative perspective, is that Iran fought a war for 8 years after the revolution. it actually was, to some degree, Iran fighting two wars. There was an internal war against a revolutionary group that wanted to be the dominant revolutionary group instead of the revolutionary group that was the dominant group, namely the Mujahideen al-Khalq, had hoped to control the revolution. They failed. And in a period of sort of a bloodbath that started out with the Mujahideen taking initiative in killing many of the leaders of the Islamic Republic, the Islamic Republic fought back and killed thousands and thousands of members of this organization. But at the same time, you had an invasion from Iraq. Now, the invasion from Iraq is what is more parallel to what happened with the French or what happened with the Russians. And as you can see from this poster, from an Iranian point of view, this was the imposed war. In other words, this conference on aggression and defense was on aggression against Iran and defense from this aggression. Iran was not, in the Iranian construction of things, in any measure an aggressor in this. You'll notice the image here is sort of lightly patterned on a sperm cell impregnating an ovum. It's a, that's the aggression here. The imposed war was imposed by Iraq, obviously, because Iraq invaded, but it was further imposed by the United States because it was understood the United States was not only horrified by the fall of the Shah, but also humiliated by the taking of the American embassy. And therefore, the imposed war, it was understood that this was something in which the Americans were, in principle, on the Iraqi side, and ultimately, the Americans were formally on the Iraqi side. And in Tehran in the August of 1988, when that conference was held, there was no question in the minds of Iranians that one talked to, but that the shooting down of the civilian airliner, that tragic accident carried out by the American Navy, was understood pretty much universally in Iran as being a shot over the bow. In other words, if Iran continues at war, the United States will kill everybody. And they will show no quarter to man, woman, or child in their effort to suppress, to help Iraq win the war. This, I think, was an overreading of things. Nevertheless, it's the degree to which this is seen as an imposed war. So it was a very patriotic war. You had a broad mobilization, but you did not have a universal mobilization. The mobilization tended to come from lower segments of the society. Well, perhaps that's common in most armies, that, the people who are able go to graduate school and stay out of the fray. But it meant that there was a generation of people coming along who were a number of years younger than those who were actually in the revolution itself, particularly as you got further into the war, and who were defending the revolution rather than actually taking action to overthrow the Shah. Now, it's important to realize that, let's say, no one under no one under 25 today in Iran has any recollection of living during the lifetime of Ayatollah Khomeini. No one under 35 has any recollection of living in the time of the Shah. That is what time does. It erases what is originally seen as a universally shared memory. We will all experience sometime in the future the appearance of a generation of Americans who do not remember 9/11. And at some point, you'll have a generation of Americans that forget 9/11. That is the nature of change as you move historically from generation to generation. So the majority of the people in Iran now don't remember Khomeini, it's a very young population, and don't remember the Shah. But they know about the veterans, because one of the things that a war produces is a lot of veterans. And veterans are perhaps the most, historically, I mean, if you look comparatively at different periods of history, demobilized veterans are one of the most destabilizing social groups that you can have in a country. It's a reason you usually try and buy them off one way or another. In Iran, there were certain benefits that went to demobilized veterans, such as university preference, so that if you wanted to go to the university, if you were a veteran, you got preference for the limited number of spaces available in the Iranian universities. And there were Iranians who did not serve and who were from a more privileged social class who saw that as being unfair. And yet it basically was the same as the GI Bill after World War II. It was an effort to find a way to systematically shift a large number of young men who had fought for the country and shift them into a different way of life through education. It's important to realize how devastating those 8 years of war with Iraq were. I certainly, as the usual outside observer, had no sense of this at all until I was flying back from Tehran after this conference in 1988. And the airplane was filled with soldiers who were missing limbs, who were going to Paris for prosthetic devices and training and so forth. And there's something about seeing, half a plane load full of people with arms and legs missing that makes you realize that something has happened that is really enormously dire. So one of the things that one might expect is that over time, the veterans would support political activities that would favor an increase in the power of the military, so that they could realize on the sacrifice that they made that the revolution was not simply a revolution to overthrow the Shah, but it was a movement to defend the revolution against the people who imposed war upon it from the outside. There were two segments to the Iranian military: the regular army and the so-called Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards were, in a sense, the equivalent of the militia. They did not have, at the time of the war, the heavy armaments, and they relied heavily upon volunteers, many of them very, very youthful volunteers who absorbed the brunt of the front line fighting. And there were networks that formed within the Revolutionary Guards that now are present in the political scene. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is well known as part of this network of people who were formed more by the experience in the war than they were by the experience in the revolution per se. So this has led some people to say, well, where is the Napoleon of Iran? Where is the great military leader who will step forward? Well, no, the interesting thing is that the great military leaders really didn't do well after the war. But whether it was in Iraq or Iran, there is a remarkable frequency of helicopter crashes that it was just terrible. I mean, if you were a top commander and you got in a helicopter, you just kept your fingers crossed, hoping that it wouldn't go down. And there's a certain school of skeptics that would say that these were scheduled assassinations on the part of the respective Iraqi and Iranian government. in order to take out the most successful and heroic of the commanders. I don't know about that. This is above my pay grade, but it's but there is no great commander. Ahmadinejad was not anybody in particular in the Revolutionary Guards. He served he's listed as serving in intelligence operations. Some people say he was part of a out-of-the-country assassination group. Other people will have other arguments about it. But he wasn't a commander. You pretty much saw that last September. He was just a guy who is now part of a network of Revolutionary Guard figures. But this is not what you found in various European revolutions, where it was the commanders that came to the fore. Now, the commanders, the reason the commanders are not the principal figures here goes back to something that I talked about in my speech 10 years ago at the Middle East Institute, goes back to the nature of military in the Muslim world. There is a long history in the Muslim world of military rule by people who come from marginal social strata. There is no hereditary aristocracy or nobility that feels that they have both a right and an obligation to command the military. In other words, the whole European notion of a martial nobility doesn't exist. Instead, you have, really from the 800s onward, and to an increasing degree, the recruitment of the officers in the military comes either from slave soldiers or people who are in one way or another marginal to the society. Essentially, it's a question of how do you handle violence? Do you do it in-house or do you outsource it? Muslim societies, on the whole, outsource. They say, no, we're middle-class, bourgeois, wealthy people. We trade. We have a nice culture. We're sophisticated. Why do we want to be at war? Why do we want to be in the army? Why don't we get those nomads or those Turkish barbarians? Well, no insult to the Turks. It's just a figure of speech. Or those, black Africans. Why don't we get somebody else to do the fighting for us? Well, this is what, of course, the Italians of the Renaissance thought as well. I mean, the notion of getting someone else to do the fighting is not unique to the Muslim world. But it's very different from the idea of having a do-nothing upper class who feels that they have a obligation to command armies, which was the situation of the European nobility. Now, what happened over time is that these congeries of officers drawn from the social margins set up governments, or not even governments. They simply set up lower-level regimes in cities and regions in which they turned their attention to making money. They thought, if we are going to be military people, we should get the money. And they became heavily engaged in commerce. And this is a system called the Mamluk system, in which you have government either at a state level or at a local organizational level that is of, by, and for the officer corps. The idea that the officer's primary objective is to be a commander in the military and to do very well financially and to have a nice home and to marry their daughters to men who come from a more substantial background. And what we have had in the 20th century, I'm obviously conflating a lot of things here. I could go on for an appalling number of hours giving you details on this. But what happens in the 20th century is that you get a misunderstanding of this by Western states, all of which are based on the idea of a warrior aristocracy. That is the European, Euro-American background. Sometimes it's the true citizen soldier like Coriolanus or George Washington, but they always had big farms to go back to. In the West, you didn't have any slaves who rose to be great commanders. They weren't given guns, for one thing, whereas in the Muslim world, they were happy to give guns to all the slaves because then the slaves, as long as they had enough money, they would defend the rest of the population. So what happened, particularly at the end of World War II, but going back really to the late 19th century, is that Western thinkers had the idea that modern military men who have scientific training and are knowledgeable about European methods of war and ideologies supporting strategies, tactics of war, and so forth, they said those people are the cutting edge of modernity. So if you have a regime run by military officers, you really have on your first step toward the modern world. So you had support by the West in the post-World War II period for a whole array of military regimes that came to power by revolutions or coup d'etat or other ways, by the United States and Britain and France and the European powers, under the mistaken modernization theory that officers will lead the way to the modern world. What the officers led the way to was a neo-Mamluk world. They created systems in which the officers were more interested in enriching themselves and entrenching themselves, make sure that they would always stay in power, than they were in democracy or free trade or liberal thinking or something like that. So you have in the Muslim world, you have a whole series of regimes that I refer to as neo-Mamluk regimes that are essentially based on the idea that, that the military elite dominate and that they control a disproportional share of the resources of the state, that they're heavily engaged in commerce, and that they base their authority or their power on this complicated relationship. Now, there are advantages to this. Neo-Mamluk armies do not like to fight wars. They might get hurt. They have all this equipment. The equipment might get destroyed. I mean, if you're doing well as an officer, you don't want to fight a war very much because you don't have that. The impetus is to establish yourself within the society. It's one of the things, just aside, that made Saddam Hussein so extraordinary is that he's the only leader in the sort of post-war Arab era who had absolutely no basis in the military. He was a thug, which meant he never went to the military academy, he never became friends of the other colonels, and therefore if somebody threatened him in the slightest, instead of making him ambassador to Norway and making him leave the country, which is what you do to your fellow colonels, you don't kill them, he would pull a gun and kill them. And he had an army, and his idea was, if you have an army and if you have a lot of weapons, damn it, you should have a war. What else do you have an army and all these weapons for? Why spend all that money if you're not going to go to war? So here you had, in a region in which the armies were extremely reluctant to go to war, you had one man who was a bull in a china shop and went to war continually. Okay, that's just aside. Now, you have the situation in Iran. In Iran, you have a veterans cohort, particularly from the Revolutionary Guard. They are tied in with a president who has been popularly elected. They are becoming increasingly engaged in the economic institutions of the society, and the Veli Faqih, the religious jurist who was in charge of it all, was a man who, from a clerical background, was much closer to the Revolutionary Guards during that war than anyone else. So in other words, the president of, let's say, Hashemi Rafsanjani, who was the prime minister and chairman of the Security Council during the war, he never really went to the war front. But Khamenei, the Veli Faqih, there are pictures of him, not only at the war front, but wearing the uniform of a Revolutionary Guard. He would change out of his clerical robes on these visits. So he's very close to these people. The concern, then, that many Iran watchers have is the revolution on the cusp of the generational change of 30 years? Is the revolution going to be overtaken by a militarization in which the Revolutionary Guard veterans entrench themselves politically and economically and create essentially a neo-Mamluk regime in Iran? Or will they be frustrated because of the limitations that they suffer that other neo-Mamluk regimes have not suffered from in the same way? And that gets me to a third topic, which I can be brief about, but I probably won't, and that's the issue of constitutions. Constitutional government in the Muslim world is a dead failure. In Turkey, you have a constitution, now in its, I think, fifth iteration, in which it's a race between the popularly elected AK party government, whether they can amend the constitution before the constitutional court rules that the ruling party is illegal. So here you have a constitution that's supposed to be up here, that's right down at the level of day-to-day politics. Now, we've had that in this country once. The year was 2000. We had a deadlocked election, and the Supreme Court voted, and they elected George W. Bush. There wasn't a person in this country who was not horrified, I don't believe, at the fact that the Supreme Court was the venue at which that election was decided, because no matter which side you were on, whether you were pro-Gore or pro-Bush, nobody wanted the Supreme Court to decide a presidential election, because the Supreme Court was supposed to be up here. And now it was getting down to the level of day-to-day politics, and if they do that on a regular basis, then what happens to the Constitution? You know, be afraid, be very afraid. All right, so in Turkey you have the constitutional issue is down to the level of day-to-day politics. Then you have Pakistan. You have a popularly elected government that is trying to reinstate members of the Supreme Court who were deposed by the president, and the president probably will try, or I'm sure he's thinking about, a coup d'etat that would get rid of the constitutional government. It's hard to tell. The constitutionalism there isn't working very well. Lebanon, they have an unwritten, unworkable constitution that led to 15 years of civil war. I won't go into the details on that. Egypt always promises that they will do things constitutionally and then absolutely violates the promises, leaving American secretaries of state sort of sucking them up and saying, what happened? You know, you said you were going to liberalize and then you didn't do it. Oh my, oh my, oh my. Constitutions in the Muslim world tend to fail. The Iranian constitution of 1906, the first Iranian revolution, it failed. So one of the issues is, why are constitutions failing? Or you could turn it around and say, in countries where constitutions work, why do they work there? And part of the answer is that they are instituted at a sufficiently high level above the day-to-day give and take of politics that they come to be respected particularly as generations pass, and the idea of affronting the Constitution seems unacceptable. So this is where you get to the question of the Iranian Constitution. The Iranian Constitution is unique, and it has an initial form and it has an amended form, with the amendments being made after the death of Ayatollah Khomeini. In the initial form, the idea was that you would have a body of experts that would determine whether any law passed by the legislature was in violation either of the Constitution or of Islamic legal principles. And that was that notion of a watchdog committee was originated back in the days of the 1906 revolution. It was not an original idea at the time of the overthrow of the Shah. But you also had the idea of the veli faqih, meaning the governing religious jurist. In the original Iranian Constitution, it says that when a preponderant majority of the population shall recognize that a duly qualified religious jurist is the leader of the revolution, then he is the leader. And it was very clearly a popular will statement saying that Khomeini is a leader because he's a leader and everybody knows he's a leader and nobody disagrees with that. He's the leader. Now the problem was that once he dies, who's the leader? And so the revised Constitution says that that after the death of Khomeini, who was recognized by the preponderant majority of the population as the leader, now it is up to another body, a committee of experts, to choose from the religious jurists, one of them to be the leader, and then it gives a series of qualifications for the leader that go beyond simply being a religious jurist, but get into issues of he should be administratively capable, knowledgeable of political and affairs and so forth and so on, and it becomes a much more mundane office. Well, that's the routinization that Weber's talking about. In other words, you take the charisma of Khomeini and now you try and routinize it. Now, what happened very, very quickly after Khomeini's death was that Mr. Khamenei became the veli faqih, and he has served as veli faqih now ever since 1989. And he's now 68 years old, something like that, and not reported to be in terrific health. Although nobody ever knows. This is, I think the CIA always says people aren't in very good health, sort of out of wishful thinking, so I'm not really sure what his health is like. But there is certainly a time coming when Iran is going to have to choose another veli faqih. That would be going into the next generation. And how they do that will be very important. Because one possibility is that Khamenei oversees the entrenchment of the Revolutionary Guards, economically and politically, and then the office is rolled over to someone who will follow in the same track, and you will end up with a nominal Islamic republic that in fact is a typical Middle Eastern neo-Mamluk regime, not very different from Egypt or Tunisia or Yemen, except that it will be religious rather than nominally secular in the way that they are. The other possibility is, or two other possibilities. One possibility is that you will have the committee of experts will choose someone who wants to stand in the way of this and who says, no, it's time to end this infiltration of the Revolutionary Guards. And the third possibility is that they won't be able to choose anyone, or they'll choose a committee, because they won't find anyone who has enough cachet in the general populace to serve in this particular role. So the issue of the veli faqih is on the cusp of being reopened and deliberated. And the reason I mention this in particular is because to some degree, it was the religious qualifications that kept the office above the fray for a long time. Khomeini, and I think early in his period, Khamenei as well, they were lofty people who, it used to be reported Khomeini would complain that people would come and ask him to decide everything. He said, I don't want to decide everything. The reason we have a government is that you people should govern. Set about governing, don't ask me what to do. And he knew his limitations. But the question is whether the structure of an Islamic republic can remain lofty in this fashion, or whether it becomes degraded into a more familiar type of militarily oriented autocratic regime. And nobody knows quite how that is going to play out. Certainly the next scheduled presidential election in August of 2009 will be viewed by everyone inside and outside Iran as a very, very, very crucial moment. Very crucial moment because not because there's a possibility that a Holocaust denier will be reelected. That is not really the central issue for Iranians. But it'll be a very crucial election because the likelihood of this Revolutionary Guard neo-Mamluk formation entrenching itself will be strongly enhanced either by a re-election of Ahmadinejad or by his being succeeded by someone who is within the same basic formation, such as the current mayor of Tehran, who is a likely competitor in that election. What will determine this? It's hard to tell. But one of the things that I think is terribly important to realize is that the strength of Ahmadinejad and of the veteran generation in Iran is based in, I'd say, in substantial measure on a national sense of Iran being a beleaguered nation. And that so long as Iran is a beleaguered nation, the chances of things moving in an undesirable direction, from my perspective at least, is increased. I think that we've gone through a number of years now of saber rattling that has strengthened the neo-Mamluks in Iran. And if we continue to do this, or if the next American president shows signs of resuming the kind of bellicose activities that have allegedly been on the table, whatever exactly that means, for the last several years, this is bad for American interests. In my view, it's also bad for the Iranian people. So I think that, as I close here, I'd like to say that I think it's imperative that the United States and Iran find their way over the next year to a more civil relationship and begin to talk to each other. And I'm hopeful on this, although certainly not confident. Last September, when we were preparing for President Ahmadinejad's visit to Colombia, that was a time when all of the American presidential candidates were expected to give their views about would war with Iran be a good idea or not. Because last September, war with Iran seemed possible in the fairly near future because the CIA had not yet canceled that option. One of the reasons I was so interested in fostering a relationship between Iran's president and Colombia was that I thought it would be the last chance, it might be the last chance, for Americans to actually hear directly from the president of a country that we were going to start a war against. And I had this thought, maybe he can say something that will help us step back from war. I remember I mentioned to the Iranian ambassador, I said, you know, I have some thoughts about what would be good for Mr. Ahmadinejad to say. And he said, well, you know, your thoughts would be welcome. Yeah. And then I thought, no, I'm a historian. I'm not supposed to diddle with history by writing the speech for Ahmadinejad. And I wasn't given the opportunity to write the speech for President Bollinger. In retrospect, I wish that I had written both speeches, because that was an opportunity that in a sense was missed. And I don't think we have many more opportunities that we can afford to miss in this way. So I am and always have been someone who sees the Islamic Republic of Iran as an absolutely intriguing and important laboratory for the issue of Islam in politics. And I hope that it lives to see a 40th anniversary and not simply a 30th anniversary. And I hope that nobody goes and blows anybody else up, but who knows? So, thank you very much. Now, assuming the role of chairman, I would like to open the floor to anyone who would like to ask questions of Professor Bulliet. Yes.
My name is Giselle, and I just had a question. What is your assessment of Iranian feelings towards this, like, in the country, towards this entrenchment of the Revolutionary Guard? I know that there's a great deal of sort of reverence and respect for war martyrs, but I don't know about their feelings towards this sort of political and economic involvement on such a deep level. Do you know about that?
Well, I don't know a whole lot about that. I read reports about the degree to which you have this economic entrenchment. It's also well known that Iranians have and almost all social strata have a very deep concern with their economic well-being. And it's also well known that there is this reverence for the generation that fought the war. But when I describe this entrenchment of the Revolutionary Guards, I don't know how transparent that is. This is something that gets reported by, say, intelligence community people or government Iran watchers and so forth in this country. And I don't know whether they're exaggerating or not, but when I talk to knowledgeable Iranians, they say, no, that's not exaggerated. That really is happening. But I don't know how transparent that is for ordinary Iranians. So I can't really answer the question. Yes, sir.
So given if one of the features of the regime type that will view Mamluk is a reluctance to engage in military adventure, a reluctance to wage aggressive war, to get into war, shouldn't perhaps the United States welcome the institution of a new Mamluk regime?
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. I mean, we have welcomed every other country. The problem is that that these regimes are also authoritarian, and they generate internal disorder on the one hand, and they tend to be economically retrograde on the other hand, so they don't serve their own populations. But certainly the more entrenched the Revolutionary Guards become, my guess is the more risk-averse they will be with respect to actually getting into a war. So yes, there would be a positive trade-off to some degree, but in the long run, not one that is good for the country.
Yeah.
Is there any parallel in your construction of the military power struggle in Islamic countries? Is there any parallel to Al-Qaeda? It's struck me that maybe they're somewhat like Saddam Hussein, certainly not military people, and they certainly are willing to fight. Are they, is that form one of the components?
No. The Al-Qaeda phenomenon, my judgment on it, is to some degree specifically related to Afghanistan and to the circumstance of the war against the Soviet Union there. But it's also related to the situation in Saudi Arabia, where so many of the al-Qaeda effectives come from. When you have a group that is not really in a country, but is rather dispersed, and in particular has forces that come from everywhere. I mean, the people around bin Laden were, Chechens and Uzbeks and Arabs and Indonesians from all over the place. Then the whole notion of entrenchment becomes kind of not useful analytically, because they simply don't have a place in which they are capable of becoming entrenched in the way the neo-Mamluk regimes are. Yes?
Yeah, I'd like to know your assessment of how the Iranians conceive the idea of exporting the revolution. I mean, now after 30 years, is it still possible, especially when there is much talk now on the Iranian influence in Iraq and its destabilizing effects on the Gulf region?
Well, that's one of the most interesting things about the Weberian approach to things, is that just because the charisma becomes routinized doesn't mean that the charisma cannot become a free-floating entity. I mean, here you have the French Revolution was a disaster. The Republic falls, it's taken over by a dictator emperor, and then he is crushed. But the, quote, ideals of the French Revolution go everywhere. Those ideals weren't realized. Those ideas weren't put into effect in France for the most part. But that notion that there is a revolution based on those ideals possible, that goes everywhere. It'll show up in Greece, it'll show up in Romania, it'll show up in Hungary in 1830 and 1848, and thereafter you have many of these references to that. Well, that's the charisma. That's the idea that there is a special quality to it. Now, the question is whether the Islamic Revolution in Iran has that exportable quality. And initially it appeared that it did, because you had pretty much everywhere in the Muslim world. Khomeini was assimilated into local notions of revolution. I remember reading a tract by the founder of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, where he said there is one revolution, there's one Islamic revolution, one thawra, and that revolution has the Mahdi in the Sudan and Khomeini in Iran and a whole bunch of people who don't live at the same time or think the same thing or do the same thing, but they were all thrown together, just one revolution. That, I think, has been tremendously diminished as an exportable aspect of Islamic revolution by the war in Iraq, and in particular by Sunni governments publicizing the idea that there is a huge, combat between Sunnis and Shiites, and it makes it very difficult for that Islamic revolution to move anywhere outside the Shiite world today. And I think we see governments in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, and other places essentially trying to respond to the manifest fact that Iran is the only state that supports the Palestinian, the militant aspect of the Palestinian resistance to Israel, and the Arab states do not support it, and they're trying to respond to that by asking their populations to forget about helping the Palestinians, instead focus on fighting against the Shiites. And it's an effort to manipulate public opinion away from 2 generations of pro-Palestinian agitation toward a new generation of anti-Shiite agitation. But I'm not sure that will succeed, but I think that it has greatly diminished because of the fighting between Sunni and Shiite in Iraq. That's greatly diminished the exportability that was once there in the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Way in the back, yes.
The question I had was, in time for the next election in
Iran, is it possible for Ahmadinejad to kind of do the whole bob himself out of Putin and pick a hand-picked successor for the next presidential candidate?
No. Ahmadinejad does not want to be succeeded. He wants to be the next president. And even if he did not, if it was a Putin situation where he couldn't do it, I don't think that he has enough of it, that there are no parties in Iran. So you don't have the type of party organization. There are no superdelegates in Iran. You don't have a group of high-powered office holders who are in a position to get together and say, here is the person. And Ahmadinejad certainly isn't not in that position. The absence of parties is something that is a rather distinctive part of the Iranian electoral scene, and it has effects at all different levels. Yes, ma'am?
I was wondering if you would talk a little bit more about sort of this pervasiveness of the revolutionary guard. Because you said the Iranians themselves talk about it, but similarly in capital within the United States, if you have this plethora of soldiers, they have to go somewhere, they have to have jobs. So if you could talk more about if there are like the government contracts the Revolutionary Guard get, if they're taking over parts of sectors and industries. I mean, if you could talk more about that in terms of its tangibles rather than.
Oh, I can't give you the details that someone who's a specialist on the Iranian economy can give. But yes, they're taking over segments, factories and industries, and they're becoming economically entrenched. The scale of it, I don't know, but it's. I mean, the question of the military-industrial complex is not a uniquely American question, and so if you have American retired colonels and generals who go to work for Beltway consultants to try and sell new weapons to the Army and so forth, is that the same thing as this entrenchment? I don't think it is, because I think the entrenchment for the Revolutionary Guards is at a more mundane level. I mean, the neo-Mamluk regimes were not strictly involved in military industry. A number of years ago, there was the case of an Egyptian general who was trying to get a law passed in Parliament so that he could sell chicken to the general population, because he produced chicken for the army. And he said, I can produce chicken and put it on the market cheaper than any of these civilian producers can. But I'm prohibited by law from selling to customers other than the army. So he wanted a bill passed. And then the civilian chicken producers said, you're using conscript labor. You're only paying them 10 cents a month to feed the chickens. Of course you can produce at a cheaper level. But that's very different from becoming a consultant for Raytheon or something. I mean, this is going into aspects of the economy that really sort of redefine military-industrial relationship.
If I could just follow up, I think you alluded to Taliban as.
Yeah.
Do you see any differences between him and Ahmadinejad? Is Taliban sort of the technocrat general, how he differs in his government?
Yeah, Taliban is the prospective opponent of Ahmadinejad for the election in August of 2009. He's the current mayor of Tehran. He has very similar Revolutionary Guard interconnections, as I understand it. He is not, so far as I know, a public Holocaust denier or someone who goes out of his way to stick his finger in the eye of Israel and the United States. That may well be an issue. I mean, the long-term interest of this stratum of the Iranian veteran generation is not to blunder into a serious war with serious enemies. So I think that he will be similar to Ahmadinejad, but not quite such a flamboyant. That's the word that came to my mind. Flamboyant's a nice word to use. Not quite such a flamboyant character. Yes, sir.
You haven't mentioned the nuclear issue. If you have a class of people who want to be entrenched and supposedly avoid military confrontation, you're certainly not going about it in a proper way.
No. A year ago, March, I was in Pakistan at the being a consultant for the International Islamic University in Islamabad. And I had an opportunity to have a number of conversations with Pakistani intellectuals before they became absorbed in who killed Benazir. And one of the things I said to was, India is just leaping ahead in such a fantastic way, and the Indian Institute of Technology is such an elite institution, and so forth and so on. Do you have anything in Pakistan that really shows that Pakistan can do what India is doing? And they said, well, we have a bomb. You have an atomic bomb. You don't need IIT or MIT or any IT because you have a bomb. Now, that seems to be, from people I've talked to in Pakistan, that seems to be a pretty general feeling, is that the nuclear program has done wonders for the Pakistani national ego. If you can build a bomb and not get bombed in the process, are the ego gains great enough to compensate for the fundamental stupidity of building the bomb in the first place? I mean, there is no use strategy for 1, 2, 3, a half dozen nuclear weapons. Everyone agrees with that. You can't use them. You don't have any warfighting strategy you can use. But the sense of national accomplishment, of getting there, is enormous because the nuclear club is so exclusive. Now, what a number of people have told me is that in Iran, the nuclear issue plays very, very well with the general population. That both the idea that they might get there and the idea that they're going to defend their right to pursue a nuclear program in consonance with the treaties that Iran has signed. So getting Iran to give up the process, I think, is very unlikely because of it was a little bit like finding someone who had the sort of masochistic will to release the American hostages. You give up your nuclear program and you give up the presidency. Once it's gone up to a certain level of national prestige. On the other hand, actually getting a bomb is very dangerous. And it's dangerous primarily for the person who has the bomb. And so, it's a difficult call. It's not going to happen for several years, and I think that Ahmadinejad will be happy to leave that to the next president if he doesn't get reelected. As one British expert who follows this very closely at the UN told me, he said, once you start the centrifuges running, there is no way of an external monitor determining the rate, the level of enrichment that you have gotten to, whether it's 3% or 50% or 90%. On the other hand, there is a limit fixed by how many centrifuges you have. And the Iranians have not been bringing centrifuges online at the rate that indicates a crash program to create a bomb. So there are people who argue that this is something that is being done because of a lot of internal benefits for having a program. particularly for this sort of this sort of inchoate neo-Mamluk group, and other people saying, yeah, it makes sense, but you never want to get to the point of actually testing it. It should be an unknown capacity. There seems to be a general feeling that ultimately people are going to concur that the benefits of a war are so few and the damage in all ways that a war would produce is so great that the world will end up tolerating an undeclared Iranian capacity to put a bomb together, even if they never test one. But nobody knows for sure that that's going to happen or how we're going to get there. One last question. Yeah.
Professor, as far as Iran and its nuclear aspirations, to what extent does Israel's presumed nuclear capability factor into what Iran is trying to do for their defense requirements? And also, as far as diplomacy is concerned, a lot of people apply like a label of irrationality to Iran in terms of international affairs. But do you think that any positive outcomes would come from U.S.-Iranian relations and diplomacy?
Okay. Well, the first thing, the Israel side of it. Iran cannot attack Israel without committing national suicide. And that's, generally, a lot of people see it that way because Israel has a capacity to retaliate and would have the international moral license to retaliate at a massive level. So the idea that there would be an Iranian object for this program of attacking Israel is predicated on the idea that Ahmadinejad has both a will and a capacity to put his country on the track to national suicide, and that usually is framed in the sense of messianism, so that the argument that is made, and you can find it made in many, many quarters in Israel and in conservative circles in this country, is that Ahmadinejad and very possibly Ayatollah Khamenei believe that if there is an attack made on Israel, that it will hasten the return of the hidden imam, and that the Iranians who were killed in a counterstrike will all go to heaven as martyrs. And therefore, that's okay if you lose 10 million Iranians because they'll all be in heaven. This notion of eschatology does relate to a popular current of messianism in Iran. Within the last year, there have been a number of arrests made of people who claim that they have either seen the 12th Imam or they know when he's coming. On the other hand, and this tends to be situated at a fairly popular level of the clergy, lower levels of the clergy. Among the senior clergy, the idea of the return of the 12th Imam is absolutely horrifying because it means they're out of a job. Their sole role religiously is to guide the community prior to the return of the 12th Imam. Soon as he comes back, they're nothing. Their job is over. You talk to an Ayatollah, I've talked to Ayatollah, I say, what do you think? He says, oh no, we don't want the 12th Imam to come back. And so you have sayings go back to the early Imams saying that it is a sin to claim that you know the hour and the day. Because if you claim that you know the hour and the day, then you are jeopardizing the whole system. And therefore, anyone who claims they know the hour of the day or that they met the 12th Imam on the street is going to go to jail. Now, the messianism at a popular level exists, but at the high stratum of the clergy, that is the controlling element of Iran, you find very little of this. So then the question becomes, and this is one that came up couple of months ago at a symposium at NYU about scenarios for Iran over the next 15 years. Would the Revolutionary Guards simply take over from the senior clergy and eliminate the senior clergy from any role in the state? And so we went around the table, and about a dozen specialists there, and said, is there anyone here who thinks that a platoon of Revolutionary Guards could go to the house of an Ayatollah in Qom and arrest him? Is there anyone here who thinks that the Iranian population would put up with the Revolutionary Guards arresting the senior clergy of the Shiite faith? Nobody thought that that could happen. They thought that the cachet of the senior clergy remains so strong, even among people who think that Khamenei is an unworthy holder of his job. But in general, the cachet of the senior clergy is so great that the idea that a conspiracy of veterans is going to take over just doesn't seem very credible. So it looks to me as though the Messiah option isn't going to come about. And then, of course, you have the technical issue that that isn't the way the end of the world is supposed to come. In Shiism, at the end of the world, and you all should be up in your Shiite theology on this, and it's very similar in Sunni theology. What happens at the end of the world is that a great tyrant appears. He's called the Dajjal. This great evil tyrant rides on a donkey. He comes, and the people of the world are drawn to him. If you've read Left Behind, even any volume of it, you'll find the same crap. Everyone's drawn to this tyrant. And then someone comes and goes to war with the tyrant and kills him by running him through with a spear. And who is that person who kills the tyrant and runs him through with a spear? That's Jesus Christ. Because Islamic eschatology is heavily based on the return of Jesus. For some reason, the evangelicals in this country don't seem to know this. Otherwise, they would switch sides and all become pro-Iranian instead of pro-Israeli. But, and then would we have an interesting situation internationally. So then, after Jesus kills the Dajjal, then he goes to Jerusalem. And he goes to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and he prays behind a man. And the imam is the man who's in front of the group of lines of people in prayer, and you stand behind him and you pray. He prays behind a man, and that is how the 12th imam is identified. So that Jesus identifies him by praying behind him in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Messiah scenario that's being put about by people like Bernard Lewis would have Jerusalem turn into a radioactive smoking ember before Jesus could ever get there to identify the 12th imam. So it's silly from a theological point of view. And it is regrettable that it has reached such a level of regard in American military intelligence circles as I know it has. So anyway, thank you very much. I think there's a reception outside.